So hello and welcome to this NPTEL course titled Trauma and Literature. We're looking at Anne Whitehead's book, Trauma Fiction. And this will be the concluding session on this book and also the concluding lecture, the concluding session for the entire course, Trauma and Literature. So we were looking at, in the previous session, we were looking at how Whitehead identifies the Vietnam War, the anti-war protests following that, in terms of locating the emergence of trauma in the public space and the public discourse, and how that influences and informs the literature around that time as well. The shaping of the literature, the shaping of the narrative designs, the play with space and time, the fragmented narratives, experimental works, etc. Now, what's also interesting is to locate the idea of trauma fiction or trauma theory, and which is also sometimes an offshoot from literary theory, that historicizes trauma theory to a large extent and also helps us understand the constant convergence trauma and representations of trauma may have with the literary lens, the literary domain, which is exactly what Whitehead is offering here. So this should be on your screen. So trauma theory emerged in the United States in the early 1990s and sought to elaborate on the cultural and ethical implications of trauma. The first three chapters of this volume explore the work of trauma theorists Kathy Caruth, Susanna Felman, and Jeffrey Hartman. These are three very big names in the field, and Whitehead, of course, is offering sort of individual chapters on these theories. Now, each of these theories emerged out of the Yale University, where they worked alongside or were taught by Paul de Man, and each took a surprising journey from literary criticism to trauma studies. Now, it's interesting to see how Paul de Man, one of the first founding figures of American deconstruction, someone who taught Guthrie Spivak, has been a very key figure, a very seminal presence, shall we say, in constructing or shaping trauma theory. Because if you look at these three people, the three big names that Whitehead mentions, Caruth, Felman, and Hartman, they all emerged from Yale University. They were taught by Paul de Man. So what they bring in is a training in deconstruction, is a training in literary theory, and how that can be how that can lend itself to an actual understanding of trauma from a theoretical perspective, from a cognitive perspective, from a literary perspective, from a narrative perspective, right? So there is that convergence, that historical convergence, which is always already there. Now, in reading, and so what Whitehead is trying to do over here is interesting. My choice of theorists reveals a specific affinity of literary criticism with trauma theory, and suggests that trauma theory is inherently linked to the literary in ways that it has not always been recognized. So, in a certain sense, trauma theory has always been some kind of a kinship, intellectual kinship, cognitive kinship with literature, literary theory, and especially deconstruction, focalization. I mean, think of the very, very conservative literary techniques, chronotop, focalization, metaphorization, sublimation, fragmentation. So all these literary techniques which were used can really interestingly be connected to the experience of trauma in terms of being a psychological experience which requires a special form of representation. Literature offers a special form of representation. So, in reading literary texts alongside trauma theory, this volume does not simply attempt to apply a psychological or psychoanalytic theory to the text. So it's not just a direct traffic between psychoanalysis and the text, literary text. It's more complex than that. More profoundly, I seek to remark on a resonance between theory and literature in ways which each speaks to and addresses the other. So there is a dialogue, a multi-directional process between literature and theory, trauma theory. So the literary readings in each of the chapters add something, or speak something that the theory cannot say. Rather than simply illustrating the theory, the readings are an extension of the theory's own silences. So, we see how literary readings can be very useful in terms of looking at silences, in terms of looking at calibrating silences. And we've had non-fictional books such as Urvashi Bhutalia's Other Side of Silence. We've had Toni Morrison's Beloved, where silence again becomes almost a liminal category. So we can see how the liminality in the literary medium can offer very interesting vantage points to which silences can be addressed and articulated and acknowledged. So theory and literature both speak to and displace one another throughout the volume, signaling to the reader the complex and supplementary relation between these two discourses, right? So there's a supplementarity, shall we say, between theory and literature, trauma theory and literature. Because literature, the very medium of literature, and we have addressed this earlier as well, but the very medium of literature is uniquely equipped to accommodate silences, accommodate half-truths, accommodate unknowability, accommodate mystery, accommodate spectrality. So all these elements which are very, very key components in experience of trauma can be brought up, can be foregrounded, can be represented through the literary medium. And that makes it so compelling as a medium, especially today. Now, Caruth's idea of trauma, of course, is one of the founding moments in trauma theory. And this book by Caruth, Trauma, Explorations, and Memory, is one of the really seminal takes, along with Unclaimed Experience, which you have read already. Now, we find that Whitehead is referring to Caruth and obviously drawing on Caruth, especially Caruth's understanding of PTSD and how that can be interestingly represented in literature. Again, the medium of literature, how that is uniquely equipped to represent post-traumatic stress disorder in terms of looking at disintegration, displacement, alienation, the experience of being in exile and experientially and also corporally, right? So Kathy Caruth's edited volume, Trauma, Explorations, and Memory, appeared as a landmark publication in 1995. Caruth combined essays and interviews by literary theorists, filmmakers, sociologists, and psychiatrists in order to emphasize the transdisciplinary nature of trauma theory, right? So there is a transdisciplinary nature of trauma theory in the sense that it can bring in elements from psychology, anthropology, cultural studies, urban geography, philosophy of mind, and of course literature, right? And medicine, medical humanities, as well as real medical science studies. So we find how this transdisciplinary quality of trauma studies is very useful, because what we're looking at is not just the human brain. It's not just an experience of trauma, but the very interesting organic relation between the mind, the subject, the selfhood, and how it negotiates and navigates and responds to the external environment, which is also mutable, which also becomes the site of trauma to a large extent. And now what it does at a very fundamental cognitive level, it blurs the borderlines between the inside and the outside. So the feeling subject and the external object begin to blend into each other in very complex ways. Therein lies the urgent interdisciplinarity or transdisciplinarity of trauma studies, right? So it's a requirement, a fundamental requirement in this discipline. Now, introduced in the volume, Caruth summarized the definition of trauma, which emerged from the diagnostic category of PTSD. So this is from Trauma, Explorations, and Memory. So what is trauma? What is PTSD? What is the whole experience and symptom of post-traumatic stress disorder? And this is Kathy Caruth from the book Trauma, Explorations, Memory, page 4 and 5. The pathology consists solely in the structure of his experience or reception. The event is not assimilated or experienced fully at the time, but only belatedly. And we'll come to the idea of Freud's idea of belatedness in a moment. In its repeated possession of one who experiences it. To be traumatized is precisely to be possessed by an image or an event, right? So the sense of possession, almost supernatural in quality. And what that means, possession, is the very idea of being possessed by something is the opposite of processing something. You are possessed by something you cannot process, right? So possession and processing become ontological and experiential opposites. So the very idea of trauma is the very experience of trauma relies on abruptness and also in the idea of not being able to process it. So there's a sense of being possessed by something because you can't process it. So and it can only appear as a belated understanding. We've seen this already in our reading of Caruth in Unclaimed Experience. And again, the whole idea of unclaimed experience, something which you cannot claim, is almost like a spatial thing, spatial temporal thing. Now, Caruth's interest lies in the collapse of understanding, which is situated at the heart of trauma. Trauma emerges as that which, at the very moment of its reception, registers as a non-experience, causing conventional epistemologists to falter, right? So conventional knowledge systems, epistemologists and knowledge systems, so conventional available knowledge systems will falter. And that shattering system, the shattering of systems, is one of the primary conditions of trauma, one of the primary principles of trauma. It's abrupt and it shatters conventional understanding of the subject of knowledge, right? And the very moment of reception is also a moment of non-processing, the moment of being possessed, right? So it registers as a non-experience because you can't understand it. It's only available for understanding and processing in a very belated way, and the belatedness is very, very important. Now, what is important is Caruth's idea of that sort of gap, the temporal gap between the suffering subject and the thing which suffers, makes the subject suffer, the experience of suffering, right? The ontology of the experience and the suffering subject, the site of suffering and the content of suffering. There's a gap, there's a liminal, temporal, structural gap. Now, so what that means is trauma carries the force of a literality, which renders it resistant to narrative structures and linear temporality. So this is the original moment of contradictions. If trauma, by definition, is a shattering of subjectivity, shattering of knowledge systems, how can that be a part of a narrative design? So how can there be trauma fiction? Is it even ontologically possible to have trauma fiction? Now, insufficiently grasped at the time of its occurrence, trauma does not lie in the possession of the individual to be recounted at will, but rather acts as a haunting or possessive influence which not only insistently but intrusively returns, but is moreover experienced for the first time only in its belated repetition, right? So this is the interesting thing about trauma. It can only be experienced for the first time in its belated repetition. So repetition is the form of representation over here. Repetition is the first awareness of trauma, because the moment of trauma doesn't allow you processing, doesn't allow you, and in knowledge doesn't allow you an experience. So it is non-experiential in quality in a certain sense, because you can't cognize it, right? So you can only recognize it, right? So repetition is recognition. So trauma is something, an experience which can only be recognized, re-cognized. So therein lies the quality of belated repetition. Now, unsettling temporal structures and disturbing relations between the individual and the world, trauma represents for Caruth a profound crisis of history, because if we talk about history as being an epistemological structure, so trauma undercuts the structure entirely, because you can only refer to it belatedly. So you can only go back to it and understand it for the first time, right? So that, in a way, is a crisis of history. So if PTSD must be understood as a pathological symptom, then it is not so much a symptom of the unconscious as it's a symptom of history. The traumatized, we might say, carry an impossible history within them, or they become themselves a symptom of a history that it cannot entirely possess, right? So history, or the knowledge system which the subject can possess, is something which is entirely unavailable to the traumatized subject, because they don't have the knowledge system, right? So it's a symptom of history. It's some kind of an aporia in history, an interruption in historical process, right? So it's not so much a system of the unconscious, but it's a symptom of history and the failure, the collapse of history. Now, and this obviously, you can see how this connects directly to the idea of brokenness in sentences, the non-temporal quality of trauma fiction, the play with space and time, the non-synchronous, non-compatible, non-linear quality of experience that trauma fiction, constantly foregrounds, because that is the unavailability of knowledge, the unavailability of known understanding or processed understanding, right? It's only a belated effort to belatedly capture the experience or calibrate the experience, which is always slipping away, which is always ephemeral to a large extent. And the ephemerality of trauma, the evanescent quality of trauma, the sort of slipping away of knowledge, is something which is always there. It's some kind of a haunting quality. It keeps coming back, but it's also slipping away all the time. So that therein lies that bidirectional quality of trauma, almost centrifugal, centripetal, that play. In a way, it's comparable to the play between what is known and what is not known, right? And that is, again, what Caruth had mentioned in Unclaimed Experience. which connects trauma with literature in a very direct, organic, narrative way, ontological way. Now, Caruth's emphasis on trauma's disruption of time or history draws on Freud's concept of nachtraglicht, and this idea of the belatedness and afterwardness, the German word is nachtraglichkeit. Nachtraglichkeit. I don't speak German very well, so maybe I'm mispronouncing it. But the idea of belatedness or deferred action that Freud talks about, like the unheimlich, so something which is outside the home. And it's outside of time to a certain extent. So outside of home, outside of space, and outside of time. So Freud's concept of deferred action or nachtraglichkeit or afterwardness is some kind of a complex and ambiguous temporal trajectory, and has proved to be a useful model for those like Caruth who seek to rethink the relation between memory and trauma and to construct models of historical temporality which depart from the strictly linear, right? So that there is that quality about Freud's idea of afterwardness. And I'm just going to wind up with this bit and also wind up the course using this last theoretical framework, this nodal point through which we can revisit the text that we have examined so far. But let's spend some time talking about what Freud actually means by this concept of nachtraglichkeit, and how this afterwardness of trauma is a useful category, useful theoretical category to understand trauma, and how people like Caruth draw on this to devise their own trauma theory. Now, so this departure from strictly linear history, this departure from a linear understanding of space and time is a condition in trauma. It's an interruption from linearity. It's an interruption from linear forms of not just space and time, but also embodiment, because even embodiment is a spatio-temporal category. You're constantly engaging with space and time in order to keep reappearing as an embodied self. And that interruption of embodiment is something which we've seen exactly happening in at least two texts we have studied so far directly, which is Septimus Smith and Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf, and also Toba Take Singh in Manto's story, eponymous story Toba Take Singh, where both characters show some kind of an interruption or suspension in space and time, and how that affects the embodiment very directly. In the Manto story, it's more graphic. You find how the subject's legs begin to swell up, and it's almost like an accumulation of space and time, because it's not moving in space and time anymore. It's stuck in space and time seem to grow inside him in a very corporeal, fleshy way, right? So there is that quality of a departure from linearity. Now, for Freud, this concept refers to the ways in which certain experiences, impressions, and memory traces are revised at a later date in order to correspond with fresh experiences or with the attainment of a new stage of development. Freud's conception involves a radical rethinking of the causality and temporality of memory, right? So again, we can see how Freud is important for us historically, although psychologically, like we keep saying, that his theories may not be scientifically valid anymore. But again, this idea of a departure from space and time, a departure from a linear way of thinking about space and time, and its non-linear temporal structure and how that corresponds to the traumatized mind is something which Freud systematically showed for the first time, or at least engaged with from an intellectual point of view. So therein lies the radical redefinition of the traumatized mind. So the traumatic incident is not fully acknowledged at the time that it occurs, and only becomes an event at some later point of intense emotional crisis. So there is that belatedness. It's not acknowledged at that time, because by very definition, it's a step outside of space and time. And only when you come back to space and time later, we acknowledge that as some kind of event which is outside of the normative framework, and it's obviously is acknowledged as an event with intense emotional crisis. So Caruth's understanding of trauma reworks deferred action as belatedness and models itself in Freud's conception of the nonlinear temporal relations to the past. Now, I'm just using Caruth over here because I'm just looking at Whitehead's understanding of trauma and drawing on Caruth, and this is the concluding bit of the session and also for the entire course, because what we can see here is the idea of play with time, the idea of play with space, is something which literature has always done since the very beginning. The very The very ontology of the novel is a play with space and time. It's offering us, any novel will offer us an alternate universe or an alternate space and time. So every novel is by default some kind of a science fiction, because it's giving us an alternate reality in which we can imagine characters move, fall in love, die, eat, do all kinds of things which we do in normal life. But it's happening in some of the space and time. So there is already a departure from space and time, which we see in the novel. The very medium of the novel, the very medium of literature, not just novel, the medium of the literature in general, is some kind of a production of an alternate reality, right, in which characters come and depart and carry out the actions which we do in a normal life, but in a different way, in a more complex ways, perhaps. So that becomes that idea of the alternate universe in which fictional characters are co-inhabiting space and time comes perhaps closest in terms of inventing a medium that can help us telescope our experiences in a different medium, in a different world, in a different worldview, in a different space and time. So the very ontology of fiction, the very ontology of literature, it allows belatedness, it allows retrospective narration, it allows retrospective realization, because it is producing an alternate universe. Very ontologically, it produces that universe, it produces a fictional landscape where characters move around, and there is a narrative control, there is a narrative quality which can interrupt linearity in space and time, which can interrupt embodiment, which can produce belated understanding of truth and reality and event. And there are novels where you can have to go back to the beginning. By the time you come to the end, you have to go back and reread it in order to understand what really took place, because there are deceptive starts, there are false starts, there are uncertain, unreliable narrators. So all these components can be sort of very, very conventionally used in literature, and they have been used since almost the beginning of the literary device, the literary imagination, the literary novel, or poetry or short story. One can think of, again, in English literature, one of the earliest novels being Tristram Shandy, where the idea of unreliable narration, the idea of interruptions in space and time, the idea of sort of fragmented space and time have been foregrounded, have been sort of almost naturalized in that novel. So it's not something new, it's not something that just happened after the Vietnam War, although after the Vietnam War we can see how the public discourse on trauma, the public discussions and debates on trauma, they all profoundly shaped the way novels were written and consumed and designed. So there is that systematic quality which emerged after that moment. But in general, ontologically speaking, novel or fiction or literature has always been about experimentation in space and time. It's always been about belated understanding. It's always been about revisiting the truth and re-realizing the truth. So literature is about recognition in a very literal sense. Re-cognition. And in that sense, the idea of trauma, the idea of belatedness in trauma, the idea of incomplete understanding, the idea of a play between what is known, what is not known, has always been there. It's always been the business of literature to a large extent. So I think, just as a way of conclusion, I think I will just end by saying that a course like this, Trauma and Literature, is very important for us to understand the different mediums that we're talking about, the medium of trauma, which doesn't allow linearity, which doesn't allow complete understanding of the event, because by definition, it's an incomplete grasp of reality, it's an incomplete engagement with reality, and the medium of literature, which in a way sort of is an industry of incompleteness, right? In a way, it promotes incomplete understanding, because any novel will give us, no matter how classic realist it is, any novel will give us open-endedness in various forms, either overtly or covertly, right? And this production of open-endedness, this generation of open-endedness in literature, is something which makes it very compatible, very organically and closely compatible with trauma, the experience of trauma, the modality of trauma. So therein lies the purpose, the philosophy for a course like this, Trauma and Literature, looking at trauma through literature and looking at literature as a site through which historical trauma, experiential, corporeal, emotional trauma can be revisited and represented. So with this, we come to an end of this text and we come to an end of this course. I hope it has been a fruitful journey for all of you. This course was recorded in very difficult circumstances, where the height of COVID, so it took a long time to finish this recordings because of different kinds of interruptions in space and time. We all experience it globally across the world. So I think this course has a very Interestingly and ironically, this is probably more relevant than ever before, the idea of trauma and literature, the idea of trauma and imagination, how trauma affects us at a daily domestic level. It's not just about a big event model of trauma and memory. It's about the dailiness of trauma, the quotidian quality of trauma, the everydayness of trauma, which is something we've experienced profoundly and very, very disturbingly during the entire experience of this pandemic, COVID-19. So thank you again for attending this course. Thank you again for going to the sessions. And as I mentioned, this has been a very complex and challenging and also rewarding experience for me as a course instructor, doing all this recording during this COVID times, being interrupted, getting out of lockdown, getting out of the house to come to the studio to record this. So in a way, this course, more than any other course I've taught so far in NPTEL, and I've taught a few, is perhaps the most experientially relevant course for me as an instructor. And I hope there'll be takeaways for you as a learner, as a student. We are all students, together. We all learning together. But I hope this will be rewarding for you as well at an experiential as well as at an academic intellectual level. So with this, we formally finish this course, Trauma and Literature, and I look forward to interacting with you in the times to come. Thank you again for your attention. Take care and stay safe.